to the Coders Campus podcast, where you'll learn how to code from one of the best teachers in the industry. Whether you're an absolute beginner or a seasoned pro, the Coders Campus podcast will teach you what you need to know to master the art of programming. And now, your host, Trevor Page.
Ladies and gentlemen, my fellow coders, welcome to episode number 29 now of the Coders Campus podcast. Thanks so much for joining, and today let's just jump right into it. We're going to be diving into the topic of while loops in JavaScript. So again, this is a situation where if you are familiar with coding, then this is going to be review for you. Most likely this is just going to be for syntactical purposes that you'll be wanting to listen to this episode. In any case, let's dive into the while loop. So the while loop in JavaScript is just yet another type of control structure. Control structures are essentially what, controls the flow of the code. If you are unfamiliar with what a control structure is, I talked about that probably a handful of episodes ago, maybe 5 episodes ago, where I talked about the if statement. So you can go back and learn about that if you are not familiar. But the main goal of the while loop is to continually rerun a specific chunk of code over and over and over again. This is very, very similar to the for loop, with just one important difference. And again, if you aren't familiar with what a for loop is, you need to go to the last episode of the podcast and listen to that one on what a for loop is. So let me take a minute to explain the difference between essentially the for loop and the while loop. So the difference between these two loops is how they decide to stop looping. Okay, you see the for loop has a specific and predefined number of iterations that it will make. Right? We know exactly how many times a for loop will iterate once the code is running and the JavaScript engine starts to execute the for loop's code. All right, so this is in stark contrast, however, to the while loop. The while loop will just keep on looping while a specific condition is true. Once the condition evaluates to false, then and only then will the while loop stop looping. So the reason why this is so different than the for loop is that we don't necessarily know when the condition will change from true to false with the while loop. So we can't really guess how many iterations the while loop will make until it stops. Okay? So this is both a good thing and a bad thing depending on the situation that you're going to run into. So let me start by addressing really the only real con of the while loop when you're talking about pros and cons. The while loop can run forever. So this is definitely qualifies as a con. You would never want a specific, piece of code, chunk of code to run forever continuously because that would log up your system. So if you're in a situation where your while loop keeps looping to infinity and beyond, then your program is stuck. It's frozen and you'll need to shut down your browser to terminate the running JavaScript program. So that's not obviously a very good user experience. You probably have, encountered this before on, I think I'm not a Mac guy. I don't have a lot of Macs or anything. My wife is, but I'm not. So I believe you get the spinning color wheel, but that could be many, many iterations ago of the Macintosh OS. So I don't specifically know, but it'll lock up there. If you're using a Windows machine, then your browser will likely sort of fade out. The text will get faded, it'll go more whitewashed, and you'll get a message saying not responding inside of the tab title of your tab or whatever. So that's the experience that people will see when your JavaScript is locked up, essentially. So having said that, an unruly while loop doesn't typically keep on running forever. And when I say doesn't typically, I mean in the vast majority of instances, the while loop should never run forever. I shouldn't even say vast number. In every instance, it should never run forever, period. But in most instances where you're programming, it doesn't run forever because as good programmers, we know to make sure that our while loop's condition will at some point evaluate to false, right? Exactly. That's the whole point of the while loop, is to make sure that at some point that condition that we're checking will evaluate to false and it will exit out of the while loop. So one rule you need to remember and always follow is to always make sure that your condition will eventually evaluate to false inside of your while loop. Okay, so having said that, the pros to using a while loop are quite abundant. So having a loop that will continually run until such a time that a condition evaluates to false is actually quite useful. An example of a while loop in action would be asking for user input again and again and again until they have provided valid input. Okay, that's just one little scenario. Another potential one would be running the same code over and over again until a specific time has elapsed, like 60 seconds have elapsed, or until it's 9 a.m. or who knows, right? There's a whole bunch of different use cases for the while loop. So let's talk syntax. Let's talk what it is that you guys have been waiting for, who already know what a while loop is. So the syntax, thankfully, for the while loop in JavaScript is very, very straightforward. You need to be sure to use the while keyword, as well as defining the condition with which the loop will run. Also, like any other control structure, the while loop also defines a scope. So, in terms of, speaking of in generic form, what the actual, what we call it, syntax is, there we go, I was trying to look for the word syntax. In general, what the syntax looks like is as follows. So you use the while keyword, obviously, to start a while loop. You type in while, and then inside of the round bracket, so the parentheses, this is where you need to put in your condition, or conditions, depending on whatever it is that you want to have to evaluate ultimately to true or false. Okay, this is where you put your conditions inside of the round brackets, and then once you close that round bracket, then you put in your scope identifiers, which in JavaScript is the curly bracket, or curly brace, whatever you want to talk about, or whatever you want to call it. And then within the scope of those two opening, or the opening and closing curly brackets, so one opening and one closing, just to be explicit, is where you put your code that you want to iterate over or loop over. Pretty simple, right? So the hardest part to figure out is what condition or conditions you need to put in the while loop for it to function properly. So remember that while the condition is true, or while the conditions are true, the loop will continue to run. Cool? So let's take a look, or let's talk about a real world example of the while loop, because I love talking about real world examples. So let's assume we want to prompt a user with a question. We want to ask them to, let's say, enter a number between 1 and 10. So what happens, like I said when I was talking about previous real world examples, what happens if they put in an incorrect value? Right? What if the number is not between 1 and 10? Well, we should ask them to enter the value again and be sure to, this time, abide by the restrictions. In other words, put a number in between 1 and 10. Silly. So this is where the for loop would fail miserably, because how the heck are we supposed to know ahead of time how many times we should ask them for the input, right? We obviously don't have a clue. So this is where the while loop comes in to save the day. You wouldn't want to just arbitrarily iterate, 5 times and asking them the same question 5 times, even though they might have entered the correct answer the first time, right? And you wouldn't want to iterate just once with a for loop if, they're going to enter a value incorrectly the first time. Not only with a for loop, you should never have a for loop that just iterates once, because then why have a for loop anyway? But I'm getting off topic here. So let's talk about the while loop and how it comes in to save the day. So your code might sound or look something familiar or similar to this. So you'd have a variable that you'd want to initialize called, the number. So you'd say var the number, which is the number that we want to prompt them for. And then we set that equal to a prompt. So in JavaScript, the keyword prompt, or rather the method prompt, will actually show a prompt, an actual sort of, alert box almost on the screen. It looks like an alert box, but it has a field, a text area or text label where they can type in some sort of value and click on OK. So the prompt will do that. So you say prompt, open your round brackets because it's a method call, and then you put in sort of what the message you want to have inside the prompt. Whatever the message you want to have say is what you'd put in there. So you'd say prompt, open bracket, open double quote, and you'd put in something like a message saying, please enter a number between 1 and 10. And you close your quote, you close your round bracket, and you put in your line terminator, your semicolon. Okay, so that's essentially where you are able to get the number from them. So var the number equals prompt, please enter a number between 1 and 10. Cool, so you're prompting them for that number. Then here's where the magic happens. You want to iterate through a while loop so long as they have the incorrect number. Okay, so you only want to iterate. Remember, the only time where you want to loop and ask them to put in the number again is when they have incorrectly put in a number. Okay, so our condition here that will evaluate to true is only when they've entered an incorrect number. So what are the situations where the number itself would be an incorrect value? Well, first of all, if they put in a number that's not even a number. So that might be the first thing I would check. So in JavaScript, there's a method call that's called isNaN, N-A-N, which stands for not a number. So is N-A-N, and then you put in brackets, you pass in the number, right? Now the number is a variable, what we call the variable of what it was that they're typing in. So it's going to check and see if it's not a number. Because if it's not a number, if that's true, then we want to prompt them again and say, hey, you entered an incorrect value. So you put that in. Is not a number, you pass in the number. That's one condition in our while loop. Well, we also have other conditions. Like what happens if they put in a number, but the number is not between 1 and 10? Well, we need to check for that, right? So we can put an or condition. So we say is not a number. The number is what we're passing in. Or the number is less than 1, right? Because if it's less than 1, that's not the correct range that we're looking for. Or the number is greater than 10. Okay, so those are the three conditions that we look for. Is it not a number? Is it less than 1? Is it greater than 10? Okay, if those are all true, then inside the scope of the while loop, so the curly brackets that we need to put in here, inside of that scope, we need to put another prompt. So again, we're going to say the number equals, we're setting the number equal to something. We're saying prompt, and we're prompting them for the number between 1 and 10. So you can put in, as your message, you could say, incorrect value entered, please enter a number between 1 and 10 or something like that. So what's going to happen here is the number is what we are looking at in terms of the variable called the number. The number variable is what we're looking at and is what we're checking for in terms of our conditions in every single part of our while loop. So this is how we're making sure that this will not run into infinity and beyond. So we want to always, we're checking against the number. So the number is what we need to constantly change inside the scope of the while loop. Because if we're checking for the number being less than 1 or greater than 10, and then we're not even changing the number inside the scope of the while loop, we're going to have an infinitely running while loop. It's never going to end. It's never going to exit, because that number, if it's not an appropriate number between 1 and 10, it's always going to loop because it's never going to change the value of the number to begin with inside the while loop. So we need to make sure that we're changing the value of the variable that we are checking against inside of the condition of the while loop. Okay, so whenever you have a condition in the while loop, whatever variables you're checking against, you need to make sure that those variables is what is changing inside of the scope of the while loop. Okay, in some way, shape, or form, over time, or explicitly inside the scope, that has to change in some way, shape, or form. Otherwise, you're never going to exit the while loop. Okay, those are my 2 cents for you. So, and then afterwards, you can have like an alert or something saying, great, you entered the number, and you can add or concatenate the number in there. So, just to prompt them to say, hey, congratulations, you typed in exactly what I wanted you to type in, a number between 1 and 10. Cool? So that's really as easy as it is here when it comes to the while loop. So the while loop is actually the only real loop in modern day programming languages. Okay, it's really the only one there is. The for loop is actually just a special kind of while loop. Okay, I don't know if you guys knew that, but that is, when you look under the covers for the on these modern programming languages, the while loop is all there is. The for loop is based on that. So how I can prove that is this is the case because you can recreate a for loop using the while loop syntax. All right. So for example, this is sort of just an aside. This, if you already understand the while loop at this point, then you don't need to keep on listening. But if you want to hear, like I said, this cool little example of how you can create a for loop with a while loop syntax, listen up. So you can start with something like a counter. You can create a variable called counter. So var counter equals 0. And then you can say while, open bracket, counter is less than 10, close bracket. Open up your curly bracket for your scope. You can say counter equals counter plus 1, or just counter plus plus. And then you can, do whatever you want. You can say console.log or, whatever you want. And you can output the value of counter, or you can do whatever it is that you want to do inside of your quote unquote for loop that's actually a while loop. And then you terminate the scope of your while loop. So what's going to happen is, like I said, we're checking the condition that we're checking is called counter. That is the variable we're checking. And we are always modifying that value inside of the scope of the while loop. In this case, we're doing counter equals counter plus 1, or counter plus plus if you want to do the shorthand. So since we're always changing the value of that, and hopefully it's working its way towards our termination condition, which is that it's going to be greater than 10. So when it's greater than 10, when it's greater than or equal to 10, it'll exit. So since we're adding 1 to counter, eventually at some point, that number will be greater than or equal to 10. Okay, it has to. If you're always increasing, it has to at some point increase beyond the value of 10. Or I should say beyond the value of 9, really, because it's greater than or equal to 10. So that's how you would write out a for loop with a while loop syntax, right? Because we know we're iterating by 1, we're checking our terminating condition, which is counter is less than 10, and we're starting with an initialization point of var counter equals 0. Okay, those are the 3 things that we have in a for loop: is the initialization condition, the termination condition, and the incrementing condition, right? So those are the 3 different aspects, and we're doing that inside of the while loop structure, just not all inside of the scope of the round brackets of the while keyword, so not in the conditions area. We're separating it into 3 different areas. So that's just a nifty little aside for you to enjoy as a tidbit of my knowledge when it comes to the while loops. So, cool. So thanks so much for checking this out. Like I said, show notes are always available via coderscampus.com/the episode number. So this is going to be coderscampus.com/29. The show notes will be, or at which the show notes will be available, or however you grammatically say that. If you haven't done so already, I would highly recommend you check out our free 30-day trial to the Coders Campus membership. So Coders Campus gives you access to every single course I've ever created and every single course I ever will create related to how to program. Cool. So you can get access to that free for 30 days. It's like 130 plus hours of content, of videos from yours truly, and it is everything you need. Essentially, completely replaces a university level education. So everything that you would need to learn in university, you're going to learn inside of this course, free for 30 days. Then it's just $10 a month after that. Okay, it's like Netflix for coders is what I say. Even if you're in university right now or college and you are struggling with learning from your teachers, this would be a great thing to check out as well. So you can check it out via coderscampus.com/deal, DEAL, because this truly is a deal in my opinion, and also in the opinions of the programmers who signed up in the, I don't even know, it's probably over 1,000 people right now are in there. So really great community of people. There's assignments, there's tests, there's exercise files. If you get stuck, you can reach out via the Facebook group and ask questions and get help from either myself or someone in the community. It's your one-stop shop when it comes to learning the Java language, and especially if you want to get into web development and learn how to create web applications with the Java language. So everything you need to know, all put into one nice, neatly little organized spot, and you can get in for yourself for free for 30 days and then just $10 a month. coderscampus.com/deal, DEAL. Let's make a deal. Check it out. Can't wait to see you in there, and can't wait to see you in the next episode of this podcast. Thanks so much for listening. Take care of yourself as always. Happy learning, and bye for now.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Coders Campus podcast. But before you go, Trevor has a favor to ask you. In order to keep these episodes free, he'd love for you to leave a rating and review the podcast on iTunes. Just go to coderscampus.com/review to leave your own rating and review of the show. So if you have 30 seconds to spare right now, please help out by leaving a rating and review via coderscampus.com/review. It will ensure that you continue to get these awesome free podcast episodes each and every week. So if you like free swag, head on over to coderscampus.com/review. Happy learning!